You see here from February 25th, the day after the Russians invaded Ukraine, from PolitiFact, quote, "There are no U.S.-run biolabs in Ukraine," contrary to social media posts. How does PolitiFact know that? Of course they didn't know that. How would they possibly know that? How could they prove the negative? But they asserted it because it was important to the U.S. government. Here, factcheck.org, March 2nd, quote, "Social media posts misrepresent U.S.-Ukraine threat reduction program." There is a threat reduction program that the United States has in former Soviet republics, such as Ukraine, designed to get biological weapons and chemical weapons under control, and that's what they're referring to. But they have no idea as well whether there are active biological and chemical labs the Russians and Chinese are alleging. They just simply decreed it to be false because their allegiance is to the United States government. Here, USA Today, also on February 25th, the day after the Russian invasion, quote, "Fact check. False claims of U.S. biolabs in Ukraine tied to Russian disinformation campaign." Let's remember that right before the 2020 election, when the genuine documents from Hunter Biden's laptop emerged concerning Joe Biden's activities in pursuit of business opportunities in Ukraine and China, with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's brother trading on his influence, this is the same claim they made. Oh, those documents are Russian disinformation. What they always say when they want you to disbelieve a story, they actually have no idea. Here, from Foreign Policy, March 2nd, you see how they're all doing it at once. The first week of the war, false claims of U.S. biowarfare labs in Ukraine grip QAnon. The conspiracy theory has been boosted by Russian and Chinese media and diplomats. Why was it so crucial for these quote-unquote fact-checkers, which are just pundits pushing an ideology, masquerading as something more elevated and noble, fact-checking? Why was it so important for them to definitively assert, not that there was no evidence for these claims, but that these claims were false, when they couldn't possibly know that? Obviously, any biological weapons programs in Ukraine, in partnership with the United States or otherwise, would be highly secretive and classified. So they had no way of knowing, and yet look at them. They all, like herd animals, united and rushed to proclaim it false. In fact, I read an article yesterday of Substack. I'm now doing this video only because the top official at the State Department in charge of Ukraine under both the Obama and now Biden administrations, Victoria Nuland, notably before working for Hillary Clinton's State Department, also was the Deputy National Security Advisor to Dick Cheney in the early part of the War on Terror, and then became George W. Bush's ambassador to NATO. A classic Washington neocon and warmonger and hawk. And yet you see she just kind of mutates from one administration to the next, supposedly some on the right, some on the left. She just stays in control of Ukraine, showing how Washington has a uniparty, one ideology when it comes to war. There was only one administration where she wasn't welcome, and that was the Trump administration. The two administrations before that, the Bush and Obama administrations, and now the Biden administration, she's fully in charge of this region of the world. And she went on March 7th, so just a couple days ago, to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and she was asked about these biological and chemical weapons programs. And everyone expected her to say, "No, Senator, of course not." But that's not what she said. She said something much different. Not just the first part in response to that question, but also what she added on to it. And watch their body language as well. A person who has lots of experience, decades in Washington. She's very cocksure, aggressive, articulate, but that completely abandons her here. It was only after her admission under oath before the Senate that you're about to hear did I start believing there was something to the story, because she said so.
I have a minute left. Let me ask you, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
The U.S. government had to come out and emphatically deny that they have biological weapons of any kind, let alone that they have them in Ukraine. Here's from a long multi-tweet thread from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who sometimes appears more like the president than the press secretary, but she went onto Twitter and she wrote, quote, "We took note of Russia's false claims about alleged U.S. biological weapons labs and chemical weapons development in Ukraine. We've also seen Chinese officials echo these conspiracy theories." She went on, quote, "The United States is in full compliance with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention and does not develop or possess such weapons anywhere." Quote, "It's Russia that has a long and well-documented track record of using chemical weapons, including in attempted assassinations and poisoning of Putin's political enemies like Alexei Navalny. Now that Russia has made these false claims and China has seemingly endorsed this propaganda, we should all be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine and to create a false flag operation using them. It's a clear pattern." That is an extremely dangerous prediction, that Russia is now about to use biological or chemical weapons inside Ukraine, that they will claim that it comes from the Ukrainians in the United States. The United States will claim that it actually comes from Russia. Weapons of mass destruction attack on European soil, where both sides are going to dispute who is responsible. She's predicting basically that will happen. I think It's really important to understand how eager the government was to deny this. Here is Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby, who similarly stated, quote, "We are not developing biological or chemical weapons inside Ukraine. This is textbook Russian propaganda." Here's the State Department, the Kremlin's allegations of chemical and biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. They said it does not own or operate any chemical or biological labs in Ukraine. It's in full compliance with these treaties. It does not develop or possess such weapons anywhere. It is Russia that has such programs. That's the U.S. government's position. We do not ever have chemical or biological weapons. He describes the Anthrax programs that were in Ukraine. And again, he's saying we did something heroic. We worked with the Soviet republics to get them under control. But he's also acknowledging, at least as of 2017, the existence of active anthrax programs in Ukraine.
The threat. Here I am in Kiev, Ukraine, the brand new junior senator from Illinois, at a public health laboratory, and he looks concerned. It's because from this kitchen-like refrigerator behind me, the director of the health lab handed me this tray, vials of Bacillus anthracis, bacteria that causes anthrax. We mapped many facilities like this throughout the Soviet Union. We were concerned that groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS could get their hands on these seed materials, starter cultures, to develop biological weapons for terrorist attacks. We had a big program to consolidate and secure these dangerous pathogen collections, some of which had been left over from the Soviet biological weapons program.
Now, again, his point is the same as the State Department's. Oh, we do work with biological weapons programs in former Soviet republics like Ukraine, but our only goal in doing so is to secure them, let them down, take them out of there. And we succeeded. But again, that leads to the question, which has not been answered, about why it is that Victoria Nuland says that these biological research facilities are so dangerous that she's worried deeply that they would fall into Russian hands, and we're working to secure them. What would be in those labs in 2022 in Ukraine, right on the other side of the Russian border, that would be so dangerous that you would be worried about that? We can't say for certain whether the Russians and the Chinese on the one hand or the US and the Ukrainians on the other are telling the truth about whether there are biological weapons programs or biological labs in Ukraine. We know for certain, because Victoria Nuland said it, that there are biological research facilities there. We don't know what she meant. We know that those are very dangerous. That's why they're worried about it falling into Russian hands. Huge amount of light on whether the U.S. government is telling the truth in issuing these statements. A lot of you probably are too young to really remember the 2001 anthrax attacks. Some of you who lived through that extremely traumatizing and turbulent time in the weeks after 9/11 probably have your memories faded about it or have forgotten about it. So I just want to walk through. It's an incredibly fascinating event with a lot of mystery surrounding it still. I spent 2 or 3 years reporting heavily on the anthrax attacks, and I just want to show you some of the really pertinent parts that illuminate the question of whether the U.S. government is telling the truth. Now, this is a fascinating article that I just want to walk you through that gives the full insight into how this really works. This is an article in the New York Times on September 4th, 2001. So it's exactly 1 week before the September 11th attacks. And it's an incredibly significant article, but because it happened a week before September 11th, nobody remembers it. It was written by New York Times reporter Judy Miller, who ended up discredited for her global reporting about Saddam's biological and chemical weapons program. But at the time, she was considered the foremost journalistic expert in the question of biological and chemical weapons. And she published an article warning that what the U.S. was doing in its own research into germ warfare pushes the limits of the treaty that Jen Psaki and John Kirby and the State Department cited to say, we always abide by this. This is the New York Times in 2001 saying many specialists inside the U.S. government believe that this treaty is starting to get violated by the development of biological and chemical weapons inside the U.S. government. Listen to this article. Quote, over the past several years, the United States has embarked on a program of secret research on biological weapons. The United States has embarked on a program of secret research on biological weapons that, some officials say, tests the limits of the global treaty banning such weapons. The 1972 treaty forbids nations from developing or acquiring weapons that spread disease, but it allows work on vaccines and other protective measures. Government officials said the secret research, which mimicked the major steps a state or terrorist would take to create a biological arsenal, was aimed at a better understanding of the threat. So they're admitting they do exactly the same thing as a terrorist organization or a rogue government like Russia or China would do when developing biological weapons. They're doing exactly the same thing, but you're supposed to think it's fine because their motive is pure and benign and not malicious or destructive. But the New York Times article said, quote, the projects, which have never been previously disclosed, were begun under President Clinton and have been embraced by the Bush administration, which intends to expand them. Earlier this year, administration officials said, the Pentagon drew up plans to engineer genetically a potentially more potent variant of the bacterium that causes anthrax, a deadly disease ideal for germ warfare. A warning 7 days before the 9/11 attacks about the dangerous and potentially illegal work the U.S. government, the CIA, and Army labs were doing to develop a more potent variant of anthrax. Among the facilities likely to be open to inspection under the draft agreement would be the West Jefferson, Ohio laboratory of the Battelle Memorial Institute, a military contractor that has been selected to create the genetically altered anthrax. A former senior official in the Clinton White House conceded that in retrospect, someone should have been responsible for reviewing the projects to ensure they were not only effective in defending the United States, but consistent with the nation's arms control pledges. The CIA's test on the bomb model touched off a dispute about government experts after the tests were concluded in 2000, with some officials arguing that they violated the Durham Treaty's prohibition against developing. Here is an article from the New York Times, October 12, 2001. So just a month after the 9/11 attacks. Quote, anthrax found in NBC News aid. An assistant to the NBC anchor, Tom Brokaw, has tested positive for anthrax infection more than 2 weeks after she opened a threatening letter addressed to Mr. Brokaw that contained a white powder, officials said yesterday. Now, it is impossible to overstate the significance of the anthrax attacks on the mindset and psyche of the American public. Obviously, 9/11 was an incredibly traumatizing event. 3,000 Americans died. It was done in spectacular fashion. But for a lot of Americans, they looked at it and they saw that it was actually isolated in power centers in Washington and New York. And therefore, people who lived in other parts of the country could maintain some psychological distance. The anthrax attacks changed all of that. They were highly weaponized strains of anthrax, not the kind that occur in nature, but manipulated in labs, highly sophisticated science that weaponized them. And they were sent through the mailboxes to numerous prominent figures like Tom Brokaw, like Senator Tom Daschle, and many others. It ended up killing 5 people who worked at the post office, people who just ran into the anthrax in the course of his travel. And it convinced people, this is like James Bond stuff now, and it's not just people who live in New York and Washington, it's actually coming right through our mailboxes, like the most sacred place of American suburbia. Everybody felt threatened by this, really unsettled. You cannot overstate the importance of the anthrax attacks. What was so alarming about them was that the U.S. government was saying this is not naturally occurring anthrax. Somebody manipulated it into a weapon, into a biological weapon. That's what made it so scary. Here was the letter that accompanied at least several of the envelopes containing the anthrax onto Tom Brokaw. Quote, it's dated September 11, 2001, obviously intended in the public mind to link it to 9/11. Is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. Obviously intending to create the impression that the same people who perpetrated 9/11 were the ones behind the anthrax attacks. On October 15, 2001, just to give you a sense for what was in the air about these anthrax attacks. For those of you who don't remember it, those of you who didn't live through it, look how terrifying this was.
From where that was mailed.
Also today, anthrax was discovered in the Boca Raton post office in Florida that handled mail for the American Media Company, where one person died from anthrax. A senior federal health official told ABC News the strain of anthrax found in Florida is confirmed as the so-called AIM strain, a strain originally cultivated in Iowa but used in research laboratories around the world. Leading authorities on biological agents say the AIM strain strongly suggests a sophisticated operation. At the White House, President Bush was asked if there is a connection to Osama bin Laden.
We're making sure that we're connecting any dots that we have to find out who's doing this, and I wouldn't put it past him.
The only thing we knew for sure is that somebody weaponized this strain. This was a biological weapon. We didn't know who did it. They were obviously suggesting it was Osama bin Laden, but there was no proof. But there you see George Bush at least giving credence to that theory. What happened almost immediately after was that leaks started coming from the government through the media, through ABC News specifically, designed to blame Saddam Hussein for the anthrax, claiming that they did an analysis on the anthrax and discovered the presence of a clay substance called bentonite. They tried to imply was some incredibly nefarious substance. In reality, it's just the clay that's used in cat litter. But they tried to claim that only Iraq uses bentonite in their anthrax biological weapons program, leading Americans to believe that it was Iraq that was responsible. This was put into the ether for at least a week in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Here, quote, the discovery of bentonite came in an urgent series of tests conducted at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and elsewhere. This is what bentonite looks like under a microscope, a substance which helps keep the tiny anthrax particles floating in the air by preventing them from sticking together. It is possible, said Brian Ross, other countries may be using it too, but it is a trademark of Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program.